Your Excellency, Mr. Chairman, Your Excellency, Deputy Secretary General of the Arab League in charge of social and economic affairs, Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today representing the UN Environment Programme, and indeed very happy to be back to Cairo. In just 45 days, heads of states and government ministers, industrial and civic leaders, scientists, and of course the world's media will gather in Nairobi for the UN Environmental Assembly. It will be just the third time this Parliament for the Planet convenes, but it will mark a major turning point for the Assembly and its member states. At a time when we must convince the world that business as usual is no longer acceptable, UN Environment is determined to lead by example. That's why the upcoming session of the Assembly will focus on achieving a significant step change for an issue that is one of the single biggest threats to human health and the environment, one emerging as a driving force behind the Paris Agreement on climate change, and one that underpins almost every goal of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development: pollution. When I talk about pollution, I am talking about any substances or energy entering the environment which can endanger human health, natural resources, and ecosystems. Such pollution impairs the use of the environment for work and recreation. It threatens the cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic values that reflect the richness of diversity of life on Earth. There are many reasons behind it, from the choice of technology when making large investments or shifting industrial processes, to consumer habits and the designs of buildings and products, and the way we dispose of waste when we have finished with our water, plastic, chemicals, and other items. But when you consider that just a fraction of the 130,000 chemicals on the market are properly tested, tracked, and controlled, or that rapidly growing urban areas already create over 10 million tons of solid waste every year, it is easy to see how the impact of such choices can be worsened by a lack of legal regulations, enforcement, and knowledge. And unfortunately, the resulting pollution can be both a catalyst and a byproduct of armed conflicts, industrial accidents, and natural disasters. Something that we can see all too clearly with the oil that's burning in Iraq and seeping into the ground in Nigeria, in the sand and dust storms blowing across the borders from Syria, the cyanide and mercury used by artisan miners in Colombia, which accounts for 80% of the gold export. Tackling pollution is one of the most complex challenges of our generation, one that threatens the intensity with rising consumption, living standards, and population growth. Whatever the root cause and trends, this lethal mix of air, water, land, ocean, chemicals, and waste pollution is very quietly killing us by infiltrating everything we eat, we drink, or breathe, and very steadily destroying the natural resources we need to support our industry, our economy, and our security. The challenge is how to continue improving people's standards of living while reducing rather than increasing related pollution. But all forms of pollution are as preventable as they are reversible if governments, companies, and industrial and citizens join forces. For too long, the relationship between prosperity and environment was considered a trade-off. Waste and pollution were seen as imposing costs and curbing growth, instead of being embraced as opportunities for profit and prosperity. No more. Take air pollution. About 90% of us breathe dirty air, which claims the lives of around 7 million people every year. It costs about $5 trillion in health care and more than $225 billion in lost income. And this cannot be dismissed as a problem for poor regions, where millions continue to pay for basic heating and cooking with their health. In the Middle East and China, sand and dust storms cause cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, traffic accidents, and schools closures. In the US, families move across states to ease the asthma of their kids. And in Europe, Paris having restricted cars, and London exceeds the safe limits for 2017 in just 5 days. Yet, affordable, clean, integrated transport or energy are game changers. So countries leading the way are creating huge social and economic advantages for their citizens and for their industrialists. It should be no surprise to anyone, then, that investments in renewable energy has grown sixfold in just a decade, that it accounts for more than 90%, 90%, of Europe's new generation capacity, and that it is creating more new jobs in China and the United States than oil and gas. In fact, around the world, 8 million people now work in renewables, and about 500,000 solar panels were installed every day, cutting costs by a quarter. And the Arab region is no exception. On a national scale, Dubai building the world's largest concentrated solar power project, Saudi Arabia launching a renewable program worth up to 50 billion by 2023, Morocco producing more than half of its electricity from renewables by 2030, but the list is much longer than that. So we can also see the young entrepreneurs seizing new opportunities. Here in Egypt, Ahmed Zahran set up Karm Solar just 6 years ago. Today, they employ more than 50 people to install and sell solar power. Having secured 30-year contracts with major food producers, they are now targeting $70 million from investors. Shaima Umar launched her biogas production project just 3 years ago. It is already being implemented in more than 12 governorates in Nile Delta and Upper Egypt, and she is keen to expand to other countries. An equally compelling case can be made for other forms of pollution. Look at the impact of failing to supply basic waste and water management. The cost to our ecosystems and biodiversity needs to be better understood, but is already causing devastation. It can be seen in the fertilizer runoff, creating dead zones in the sea and killing bees. In the nappies, pizza boxes and popcorn bags increasingly linked to cancer, hormone changes, and other health risks. And the microplastics making their way into our biodiversity, food chain, and dinner plates. The costs to humans is an unmeasurable mix of malaria, mercury poisoning, diarrhea, and other preventable diseases. Every year, it contributes to the 13 million people dying from environmental causes, with children and low or middle income countries bearing the brunt, including the 4,000 children that die every year from dirty water and poor sanitation. And the cost to our economies is a long-term burden arising from lost workdays, medical bills, and loss of precious natural resources. It locks families into poverty, puts businesses at risk, and slows progress for entire communities, countries, and regions. But if you decide to flip those problems, then incredible things become possible. Take tourism. In the Caribbean, about 85% of wastewater is pumped into the sea untreated. Yet, 1 hectare of healthy coral reef can be worth over $1 million a year. What about consumer products? Demand for plastic has increased 20-fold in the last 50 years, and up to 13 million tons of plastic is thrown into the ocean every year. It is already affecting more than 600 different species, with everything from whales and dolphins to seabirds and turtles, and even tin mollusks falling victim to it. Something I'm sure will be tackled when the next gathering of the Convention on Biological Diversity is hosted here in Sharm el-Sheikh next year. Instead, why not recover the plastic packaging worth up to $120 billion before it hits the ocean? Or explore innovative alternatives like using the excess algae being created by nutrient pollution to use as feedstock for 3D printing, something that is being experimented in China and in the United States. On an industrial scale, take something like air conditioning. Today, there are close to 1 billion units, but in the next 30 years, that market will be around 2.5 billion units. If every unit is the same price and performance as the most efficient units today, the energy savings would be like switching off about 2,500 power plants, and it would save around 100 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Or take cell phones. We all have cell phones, and I do have one. These ones. We buy 1.5 billion units every year, and 440 million computers and tablets every year, which explains why we end up illegally dumping around 50 million tons of electronic waste every year. It competes with an array of toxic substances and gases that damage the ozone layer and the climate. Yet, that also contains valuable substances that are expensive to extract, not least about 300 tons of gold, around 11% of global production. That waste is usually worth over $50 billion a year, and the legitimate waste market is already worth more than 88 times that. In other words, there is no such thing as waste. There are only wasted opportunities. Of course, pollution is not a new phenomenon, nor is action to counter it. What is new is the very real window of opportunity to accelerate and scale up that action, to turn something that threatens our very existence into a sustainable source of health, wealth, and well-being. Incredible advances in science and technology allow us to better understand the problems, monitor progress, and develop solutions. Growing demand and action from individual citizens and consumers are paving the way for new policies and products. New markets for growth are being snapped up by business and investors. And governments are leveraging all of this to not only deliver benefits for their own people, but to deliver unprecedented progress through international cooperation. The big question for all of us: can we realize the incredible appetite for change that we saw emerge from those landmark agreements 2 years ago, respectively in Paris and in New York? I mean the climate agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe we can, if we leverage innovation and competition to intensify and accelerate these trends around the world. At the UN Environmental Assembly, there will be focus on 5 practical steps to help achieve that. First, encouraging political leadership and partnerships through a global compact on pollution to ensure high-level engagement from both the public and the private sectors. Second, strengthening policies and governance through risk assessments, enhanced legislation, multilateral agreements, and other measures. Third, adapting our lifestyles and economies to embrace sustainable consumption and production, resource efficiency, and waste management. Fourth, mobilizing finance, investments, and innovation in low carbon and clean opportunities to better understand, manage, and counter pollution. And fifth, advocating for action. Citizens need to be informed and inspired to reduce their own pollution footprint and advocate for bold, pollution-beating commitments from the public and the private sectors. So we cannot fail to realize either the size of the challenge ahead of us or our ability to put some of the most significant social, economic, and environmental developments in a generation within our grasp. In conclusion, let me say that tackling the pollution challenge is vital to securing human well-being. This isn't a choice between a healthy environment and a healthy economy. We can and must have both to fulfill the rights of future generations. As the UN Climate Conference in Morocco highlighted, there is a clear and unbreakable connection between clean energy and energy efficiency, pollution, and global warming. Whichever way you look at it, the right choices are just as profitable for business and the economy as they are for the planet and its people. They protect social, economic, and environmental development. They combat climate change and desertification, and of course, they curb pollution. So I want to thank you for your efforts, but also to ask all Arab cities, companies, and citizens to support the UN Environmental Campaign to beat pollution. Member states took a bold decision to focus this year's assembly on pollution. This is the perfect way to turn that decision into tangible action. I thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.